In today's business world, companies outsource just about everything. But that raises a huge question. How do you audit a company when a massive piece of its financial story is actually happening somewhere else, in another company's building? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on a little known but super powerful rule that answers that exact question. ISA 402.
Okay, think about it like this. Your own paycheck, right? There's a pretty good chance it's processed by some third-party company you've maybe never even heard of. Now, put on your auditor hat. How can you confidently sign off on a company's financial statements when a critical piece of that puzzle is locked away inside a totally different business? And that is the exact challenge we're tackling today.
So, to crack this case, we're going to follow the clues. First up, we'll lay out the whole outsourcing puzzle. Then, we'll take a peek inside what I call the auditor's black box. After that, we'll introduce the official rulebook that makes this whole investigation possible, get to know the key players, and then examine the two crucial pieces of evidence. And finally, we'll see how an auditor puts it all together to reach their final verdict. All right, so let's start with the puzzle itself. Outsourcing makes a ton of business sense, right? You hire specialists to do what they do best. But for an auditor, this creates a huge headache. A really critical part of the financial story is happening completely off-site, and that creates a massive potential blind spot in the audit. And listen, we are not talking about small, trivial tasks here. These outsourced services are often deeply woven into the very fabric of a company's core operations. They have a direct line to the financial statements, which means any mistake they make becomes the company's mistake. And that leads us straight to the auditor's main dilemma. They have to vouch for the entire financial picture, but a huge chunk of it is locked inside this black box, the service organization. They know something really important is happening in there, but they just don't have the key to get inside. So the goal isn't just to get a quick peek inside the box. No way. The auditor's mission is to get their hands on sufficient and appropriate evidence. They need real concrete proof from that black box to figure out if there's a serious risk of a major error in those financial statements. So how in the world do they get that proof? This is where ISA 402 steps onto the scene. It's the official rulebook that makes all of this possible. And to really get the rules, you gotta know the players. There are 4 key roles in this whole financial drama. First up is the user entity. Pretty simple. This is the main company we're looking at. They're the ones who hired the outside help and whose books are being audited. They're the client. And then you've got the service organization. This is our black box. It's the third-party specialist that's actually doing the outsourced work, whether that's processing payroll, managing massive data centers, you name it. Now here's our hero, the user auditor. They're hired by the user entity, and they're basically the detective tasked with verifying everything, including the work that's being done inside that locked black box. And finally, the character that changes the entire game, the service auditor. This is another independent auditor, but they're hired by the service organization itself. And their job? To go inside the black box and write a report on what's really happening. They are, for all intents and purposes, the user auditor's inside source. So, how does this inside source actually report back? Well, the user auditor can't just take their word for it. They need cold, hard evidence. And that evidence comes in 2 very distinct flavors, both cooked up by the service auditor. Think of it this way, okay? A Type 1 report is kind of like the blueprint for a high-tech security system. It shows you the design and it confirms that on paper it should work. But a Type 2 report, that's the full inspection. It goes way further. It actually tests the alarms, it checks the locks, and it proves that the system was working effectively over a whole period of time. So here is the absolute key takeaway on that. A Type 1 report is a great starting point for understanding how the system is supposed to work, but it offers exactly 0 proof that the controls actually did their job. It's just a snapshot in time, not a performance review. And that is exactly why the Type 2 report is the real prize here. If the user auditor wants to truly rely on the service provider's systems and reduce their own testing, they must get a Type 2 report. It is the only document that gives them the evidence they need to prove the controls were effective. Okay, now for the climax. The auditor has the evidence. The report is finally in their hands. So how do they use it? To deliver their final verdict on the company's financial health. Well, it's not as simple as just flipping through the report. A good detective always follows a process. First, obviously, get the report. Next, you have to vet your source. Is this service auditor actually competent and independent? Then, check the dates. Does the report cover the right time period? They also have to look at what the company itself is doing to manage the whole thing. Then, and only then, can they finally decide if the evidence is strong enough to close the case.
But what happens if that proof just isn't there? The fallout can be huge. It's called a limitation on the scope of the audit, and it can trigger a qualified opinion, which is a massive red flag for any investor. Even worse is a disclaimer of opinion, where the auditor basically throws up their hands and says, look, we just couldn't get the evidence to do our job. Something like that can absolutely shatter a company's credibility.
And this really gets to the heart of it all. A company can outsource the work, sure, but it can never, ever outsource the responsibility. The auditor's fundamental duty to find the truth doesn't change one bit, no matter where in the world the work is actually being done. So, you see, what started as a pretty technical deep dive leaves us with a much bigger question. In a world that's built more and more on outsourcing, rules like ISO 402 are so much more than just guardrails. They're the very threads that hold the fabric of trust together. They ensure that even when the work is out of sight, accountability is never, ever out of reach.